USS Saratoga was originally CC-3, the third Lexington-class battlecruiser ordered. However, when the Washington Naval Treaty made it impossible to complete the class as designed, 2 of the 6 ships were selected for conversion to carriers. Although laid down slightly later than the CC-2 USS Constellation, Saratoga was actually closer to completion at this point, and so she, along with USS Lexington, were the ships that moved forward with the radical redesign that would turn them into fleet carriers. Having been laid down in September 1920, the changes meant that she would only launch in April 1925, with a hull number that, as it turned out, only needed 1 letter changed. CC-3 was now CV-3, thanks to the existence of USS Langley taking up CV-1 and Lexington taking up CV-2. Applying some early lessons from the US Navy's first diminutive carrier would further mean that she only commissioned in November 1927, with an air group whose size varied quite considerably depending on what was aboard and also how you counted it. A torpedo bomber heavy air group, for example, had fewer aircraft than one that was more fighter heavy, and there were additional spare aircraft and parts suspended from the top of the hangar. But on average, the ship would carry between 70 and 80 in-service aircraft, with a varying number of additional spares hanging from the ceiling. She sailed with a big black stripe. This was to help pilots tell her apart from her sister ship, since landing aboard the wrong carrier was seen, even in these early days, as an easy way to get yourself thoroughly ridiculed and your aircraft thoroughly graffitied. With a few minor shenanigans along the way, she set out on a combination shakedown cruise and relocation, heading ultimately to join the bulk of the US Navy's heavy hitters off the coast of California. Here, she spent most of the interwar period getting stuck into a series of fleet problems. These were massive yearly exercises that, in theory, served to test out new ideas on how to use the fleet, as long as everyone played relatively reasonably and paid attention to the outcomes. During 2 separate exercises in the 1930s, the 2 big carriers managed successful surprise strikes on Pearl Harbor, for example. Quite often, the 2 sister ships would end up facing off against each other, though. This was so that both sides of the exercise would have a proper carrier to play with occasional visits from their short-lived but impressive airborne cousins. One element that came through quite often was the vulnerability of carriers to other carriers' airstrikes, which would in turn influence the US Navy's ideas of operating each carrier independently at the heart of their own escort group, so that any given incoming strike should, in theory, only find and sink a single carrier. In mid-1941, with tensions rising, she was given some additional anti-aircraft guns and some basic radar. The refit meant that she was on the west coast when Pearl Harbor was attacked, and as a result she was sent almost immediately to reinforce Wake Island. But this mission was aborted when 2 Japanese carriers were reported to be in the area. Given Saratoga was on her own with barely a dozen of her own fighters for aerial defence, that was probably a wise move. At the start of 1942, she was unlucky enough to be torpedoed by the submarine I-6, forcing her into dry dock again, during which time she swapped her 8-inch deck guns for a more useful 5-inch 38 dual-purpose battery, along with even more light and medium anti-aircraft guns, more radar, and additions to her torpedo defence system. This meant that she missed Coral Sea and Midway, but showed up just in time to support the Guadalcanal campaign. Here she would fight numerous small attritional air battles against the Japanese air forces, punctuated by the occasional larger encounter. At the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, her flyers would claim the carrier Rugio, but shortly thereafter she was torpedoed again by another Japanese submarine, this time I-26. The repairs this time caused her to miss out most of the remaining elements of the Guadalcanal campaign, but she showed back up just in time to relieve the rather battered and punch-drunk USS Enterprise and take over as the only operational full-fleet carrier the US Navy possessed, which would in turn lead to her operating alongside the carrier HMS Victorious in its guise as USS Robin. This exercise, amongst other things, led to swaps of aircraft that temporarily left the American carrier almost entirely equipped with strike aircraft, whilst the British carrier was covered in everybody's fighters, as each carrier was now operating mainly the aircraft that it turned out they excelled in utilising. As the first new light and fleet carriers began to arrive, and Victorious went home, Saratoga then joined the rest of the fleet as they went on the offensive, attacking Japanese installations, fortified islands, and ships throughout most of 1943, followed by a short refit over Christmas, and then kicking off 1944 with more raids, as well as providing air cover for numerous American landings as the Japanese retreated. As 1944 rolled on, she was assigned to support the British Eastern Fleet as it began to spin up its own offensive against the Japanese. And once that was in full swing, she was sent back across the Pacific for a more comprehensive refit that lasted for most of the rest of the year, before being assigned to help develop night strike carrier doctrine for the US Navy, a task in which she joined Enterprise in early 1945. Whilst Japan was on quite the back foot at this point, the Japanese pilots were still dangerous, and a single moment of overconfidence, which led to the ship being sent out with only a trio of destroyers as escort, saw half a dozen bombs and almost as many kamikazes come raining down, and she was headed back home for repairs once more. With so many Essex-class now in service, Saratoga would re-emerge from the dockyards as a training carrier, a role that she fulfilled for the remainder of the war, after which she had a brief stint as part of Operation Magic Carpet, and then her final assignment as a target in the atomic bomb tests of Operation Crossroads. She survived Test Able, the airburst, fairly well, but Test Baker, a bomb detonated just under the surface a mere 400 yards away, was more than enough to sink her. But, thanks to the effects of the tides, she's now actually a relatively safe wreck to dive, having sunk in relatively shallow water.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.